All right, I think we're ready to start. So typography and how it works in CSS. Um, so I'm Martine. I'm going to talk to you guys today about typography, as the name so keenly implies. But basically, how I came about this talk is I used to do a lot of calligraphy, and I worked in the general traditional art space for a long time, where a lot of my work did involve a lot of lettering. And then I moved to the web, and that kind of how pretty my handwriting was became completely defunct very, very quickly, because all of a sudden nobody cared that I could make these beautiful letters. And so I started looking at how can I translate that skill and that love for pretty lettering into the web. And I realized that CSS actually has a lot more properties than one would think in terms of making very, very pretty things. And that a lot of the vocabulary and a lot of the concepts actually are very, very parallel to the print world. So that's what we're going to look at today. Um, by the way, feel free. I am looking at chat. I am looking at um, both of them, the Slack one and the other one. Feel free to interrupt me either vocally or through the chats to ask questions. Whatever you're most comfortable with, I'm happy to answer questions as we go. But first, let's go back in time just a little bit, like a little massive little bit. When we consider writing and the form of communications, whether it was painting with our hands or using some more sophisticated tool or medium, throughout history, we can see a thirst for knowledge, and we can see wanting to communicate that knowledge. We go from representing daily life things, such as the Paleolithic Lascaux caves, which is the horse on the bottom left, or which are in France, or some more religious and ritualistic type of writing, such as what we see in the pyramids. But whether it's the day-to-day stuff, or we're moving on to more business-like transactions, such as why the Phoenician and alphabet and early Greek alphabets came about, because they needed a very quick way to write business transactions. You see that that's something that we've been trying to do throughout history. Fast forward just a little bit. I'm going through history really, really fast. We're skipping entire swaths of centuries. This is in the interest of time, because I figure you guys are here for the CSS, not so much the history lesson, but it's important in terms of the concepts. And so what you get is the real breakthrough and the real change in how we look at typography today is kind of when the first big step was the Gutenberg press, because now we went from a book is handwritten painfully and mistakenly, and all documents are handwritten. So you might have, if you're a bestseller, say like the Bible, you might have a couple hundred copies out there, but you're still talking in terms of hundreds, not thousands. And those are going to be done one by one, page by page, more than likely by a scribe or a monk somewhere, over periods of years. The press allowed for multiple copies very, very quickly. And then you followed that by the steam-powered press, which really increased that debit and that output. And then comes along the web. And now the web allows anybody who even doesn't necessarily have access to an extremely expensive steam-powered press to publish whatever. And and then we add CSS on top of that. CSS level 1 came about right in about 1994, and we start being able to style that and make it pretty. And so we go from these beautiful, illuminated manuscripts and these beautiful plates from printing to a very raw HTML, where there was really no pretties to speak of. And I use the word pretties loosely. But now with CSS and with more and more web fonts being published, we can start really playing with our type. So what is typography? Typography comes from the Greek. The word comes from typos, meaning impression, and the Latin graphia, meaning to write. And so basically, it's the art of designing with type. And so how do we achieve that on the web? Well, that's where CSS comes in. And the first kind of question is, well, what typefaces should I use? So I use the word typeface, and that's to refer to what it is that our type looks like. So in this particular slide, I've got two different ones. I've got Montserrat and I have Railway, right? So each of those are different typefaces. But there's so many out there now. How do we kind of choose and how do we implement those? Well, in terms of the CSS, we use font family. So we go ahead and, we can dictate whichever one we want. And we'll talk a little bit about how those work in terms of the less common ones here in just a little bit. But let's take one step back and kind of look a little bit at some of the vocabulary that comes along with it, because we're going to be referring to some of that as we're talking to the various CSS properties. The big things are there's kind of two types of main types of alphabet, serif and sans serif. Those are the little squiggly marks at the bottom, such as the bottom, the A. It has those little straight marks at the bottom. Those are serifs. And those actually come from when people were still using chisels to carve letters into things. It was that chisel mark to finish the letter cleanly. And so that's kept over in terms of how we view our fonts today. We have that main line and baseline are something and the X height, so that's the area between the main line and baseline, that's going to come into play because of units that we can use. And then when you're looking at a letter, when we start, a lot of us, if we've done any kind of design, we've heard sentences like, the lazy fox jumped over the whatever. And it's those sentences that use literally every letter of the alphabet. And there's all sorts of them, some cleaner than others. But realistically, we don't have to look at the entire alphabet when we're trying to determine differences between them and when we're trying to choose which one we want to use for our website. There's a handful of letters that in all alphabets are going to be quite distinct. And those are going to be the R, T, W, H, A, E, G. And those, generally speaking, have a lot more characteristics than most other letters and are a lot less, for lack of a better term, blah than a lot of the other letters. So that's where you're going to be able to usually see what kind of style an alphabet is going to have. The ampersand also is a good one to look at, not necessarily a letter, but generally it has a lot of character to it. So it's one that to look at when you're trying to compare, are these two typefaces actually the same? Did I mess up and use the wrong one? Those are good letters to look at as well. So there's kind of, on top of serif and sans serif, which we've already kind of talked about, there's actually two more categories. One is display, and the other one is monospace. So for serif and sans serif, the main places we're generally going to use them is going to be in our main body of text. When we have big amounts of text we want to convey, like your articles and such. Generally speaking, they've done some studies on that, and on the web, sans serif is actually easier to read. And in print, serif is easier to read. And they've been able to determine that the quality of the font has nothing to do with its readability, up to a point, right? Up to a point. But that generally speaking, if it's a halfway decent font, it's what people are used to. And since a lot of the older fonts and a lot of the fonts we see in print historically had been serifed, and when the web came around and Web 2.0 and a lot of that design, a lot of people started using sans serif, you got to see that being what people got used to and what people are used to seeing. And so that's where the readability lies. Display fonts are going to be all your fancy schmancy fonts. They're going to be your fun things. They're going to be your completely different out of the blue things. And they're great for things like titles, and used very, very sparingly for character and for giving something a little bit of, jazzing something up, giving it a little bit of personality. But in terms of using it for large bodies of text, they're terrible because for the most part, their readability is garbage. And when a lot of the studies that are done on readability, they look at three different factors: the speed at which you can read it. Can you read it and understand what in the world you're reading? and can you retain what you're reading? So those are kind of the three categories when we think about readability. It's not just can I recognize the letters, it's also can I understand what in the world I'm reading. The last type is monospace. As developers, we are probably very intimately aware and knowledgeable of monospace fonts because that is most likely what you're using in whatever text editor or IDE. And the main characteristic and way to recognize those is that unlike other letters or small letters like an I, other alphabets where small letters like an I will take up a lot less space than larger letters like O's and W's, monospace every single one takes up the same amount of space, which is why you get that weird blank space between the H and the A, but they line up beautifully in our code. So they're very convenient for that. So when we want to take in a font for a website or for an application that we're building, great. The listed over here are web safe fonts, which are basically Georgia, Time New Romans, Arial, Trebuchet, Verdana, and Courier New. If you want to make sure that unless you're loading a specific font, you want to make sure that your users actually have it on their machine. And so those are pretty much your safe list, or at least according to Mozilla. So what we want to do is generally do several things in order to make sure we load all of those fonts. We can reference a library and go ahead and load the font. Or we can also include some fallbacks. So in the code snippet above the table, I have body font family, Barlow, which is some random font, and then Helvetica, Arial, Sans Serif, so that I can have some fallbacks in case Barlow doesn't load, right? And so I can control that because if the font doesn't get loaded, it is going to go to whatever the browser default is, right? So I want to maybe control that a little bit more. When we look at typefaces, this is an entire type family. And the thing to keep in mind is when a font is bolded or when a font is thinned or italicized, generally speaking, that is not an algorithm doing it for you. Those are very separate sets of fonts. So if you think back to the printing press, there was no way for an algorithm to do that for you, right? You had to have a separate set of the little metal block to go ahead and set in your printing press for each weight of that font. Well, the most fonts today are still very much built that way. And so if you want to have access to the entire series, you have to load the entire series. That's changing a little bit with the concept of variable fonts, but that's still very, very true for most things. So be aware of when you're choosing your typeface, one, how many of those variations are you going to want to need and use? Because there's no point in loading everything if you're only using two, because, wait on your application. And also, when you're picking a font, making sure that you do have some choices in terms of should you want to bold something, does it actually exist in that typeface? One of the sites I use a lot to choose my fonts is Google Fonts for several reasons. One, fonts just like pictures and music and art have copyright. So a lot of those free download fonts completely ignore copyright, and that's generally bad. We don't like doing that. So the other thing is, if you don't know the source of your font, there's always obviously the potential for a virus, which we don't want either. So I like going there because I know my fonts are going to be clean and I know I'm legally allowed to use them and I'm cool on that front. The other reason is because I can choose with their search tool very easily what I'm looking for. And so that number of styles is going to be that drop down where it allows you can choose, I want something where I've got some choices versus I really don't care, right? So generally speaking, once you've picked your thing, it'll allow you to download it, customize which one of those you want to go ahead and get. And that's where this little piece at the bottom, the weight and the gets added in so that it makes sure that you have those two variations loaded. You can do that as an import in your CSS style sheet, or generally speaking for fonts, you can also load them as just a normal rel style sheet in your HTML files. The third option is to literally download the font and include it as part of your assets. So those are kind of your three options for loading fonts. So once you have a font picked and you go ahead and use weights on said font, if you have them loaded, that's great. Generally speaking, there's kind of several ways of determining the font weight. Normal and bold are fairly well known, but there's also increments from 100 to 900 that you can use if you want more specific tailoring. 400 is normal, 700 is bold. Be very careful once you get under 300. Under 300 makes them very, if you have a nice 4K typey screen, they make these beautiful, really thin, really lightweight layouts that are completely unreadable for anybody on a phone or low resolution device because it's so thin it's unreadable. So be very careful with anything under 300. If you don't happen to have every variation loaded and you go ahead and give it a variation, guess what happens? Nothing. So that's kind of where you want to make sure that if you're not using a variable font that you have whatever indications you want. We also talked a little bit about italics, and there's kind of two variations on italics. There's italic and oblique, and it is a royal pain in the butt. Because what happens is if your font happens to have italics and you have it loaded, even if you tell it oblique, and you don't have also an oblique, it'll default to oblique. And vice versa. So if you don't have one but have the other, they'll automatically flip-flop and determine the other. However, technically speaking, they don't do the same thing. If you look at the F on each of those examples, you'll notice they're vastly different. Because what italics does is it takes that different font file that exists, right? And it pulls that in. And a lot of times with italics, you'll see some of the letters change a little bit from the standard normal straight up and down font. Oblique is that algorithm I was talking about earlier. It will literally slant your letters. So we'll take the up and down straight one and slant them. The thing is, if you have an italics available, you won't be able to do an oblique. If you have an oblique available and no italics, you won't be able to do an italics. The cool thing though about oblique is, should you get it to actually work, you can do some really fun stuff, like determine what angle you want it angled at. So of course, if you push it to the nth degree, it becomes completely unreadable, but it does give you some sense of being able to really tailor that. And if I went for negative degrees, it would slant the other direction. So that is super cool. Any questions on that so far? Now we're going to get into some more obscure variations and some obscure ones that you guys might not know about. So everybody kind of knows drop shadow because drop shadow is fun and got totally overused for an entire set of histories of the world. But guess what? We can do that to letters too. So we can do drop shadows and to our letters, and it's called text shadow, which works very, very similarly to drop shadow, where you've got offset X, offset Y, blur radius, and then your color. So you can do some fun things there. I don't use it a lot because it very, very quickly looks tacky, but I felt the need to include it because it exists and we're talking about things you can do to your type. So there you go. That's a fun one. Be very careful on readability on that. It's very, very easy to make something completely unreadable using text shadow. So what we have in terms of, then we have our large bodies of text, right? I've used a simple sans serif font. And when we look at our lines, they're kind of scrunched together. So if we wanted to say gives them some breathing room, that's where we're going to be looking at leading. So the reason we call it leading is because when on an old printing press, wow, words, on an old printing press, literally they were bars of actual lead. That must have been great for people's health. But they were, and that would determine how much space is between each of the lines. Instead of leading, we call it line spacing in CSS. We're not using the arcane term, but what we can do is go ahead and say your line height, we can set it to whatever value you want. Downside to actually putting a unit on your line height means that it does not take in consideration what your font size for that line is. So as much as it looks great on my little text, my span that I've blown up the text for, now it looks like garbage because it didn't take in consideration the fact that it doesn't look at what my font height is for that particular span and adjust accordingly. So the solution for that is to not use any units. If you don't use a unit, it's simply relative to the font size in that particular element. So in this particular case, I'm telling it that I want the gap between my lines, or the line height, to be 1.75. So it's basically 3/4 larger than whatever the default would have been. And that's going to allow you to basically set that as a general rule, say on a paragraph tag, and not worry about, hey, I'm going to increase the font size over here or decrease it over here for emphasis. So that will work much nicely. It will also work much more nicely with things like magnifiers for accessibility purposes. It will magnify much more cleanly if you're not using units. But you can, if you want the ridiculous overlay effect like that, you totally can. It will totally work. The other big piece when we were looking at some of the old pretty manuscripts were drop caps. And those are really pretty ornate first letters. And we can totally do that in CSS as well without having to clutter up our HTML and add random spans places. And that's using the pseudo element first letter, which totally works and allows you to, it's going to select the first letter of whatever tag or whatever class or whatever ID you set it on. So in this particular case, I've used, a color of gold, display block. It's the reason I have a float and I have some margins and so on is because what it does is it sets itself naturally at the baseline. So the baseline is the line that if you were to draw a line strictly under all of your letters, under not the ones that have downspurt, so not P's and G's, but like your O, your T, those letters, if you were to do a straight line underneath there, what would happen is that it wants to set itself there because the letters naturally align themselves on the baseline by default. And so in order to make it drop, that's why we have to do the extra work with the float and the margins and so on to make it fit like that, like a drop cap. But you can do all sorts of fun stuff. The other thing is, if you don't want to stop at the first letter, you can go on and do your entire first line if you want and play with that. Because there is this pseudo property called first line, which literally selects the first line. And so that allows you to do something fun on your first line without ever having to, again, worry about putting some kind of span or HTML. It will be the first line based on your the width of your window, which is super cool. So for responsive purposes, this works really well. Excuse me. So we've prettied up our first line. Excuse me. We've prettied up our spacing between our lines, but our links are still kind of fugly. So let's look at what kind of crazy stuff we can do with them. The first thing we can do is play with text decoration. And text decoration takes several different properties, including the line, which is where we want it, the color, the style, and how wide. And so you can do them individually with text decoration, line, color, style, etc., or you can do the shorthand, which allows you to string them all in one big fat property. So what can we do with that? Well, the first thing we can do is choose where in the world the line goes. So we can have no line at all. We can overline, underline, and we can cross through, and we can even do multiples at the same time, which is really cool. I'm not sure what use case you would use for that, but you totally can. So if you start stringing more than one, it will totally add more than one. The other thing we can do is choose what kind of line we're going for. So we have solid. They're the same as you would have for border, for example. They're going to be solid, double dotted, dashed, but we also have wavy. So if you ever, the underline that you get for not being able to spell, I get that one all the time. Yeah, that's totally what that is. And so that's super cool because it allows you to, if you're using something maybe a little bit more, you want to do something a little bit less heavy, using dotted, for example, can go a really long way. The other thing you can do is determine where in the world that line is going to be placed. And you can use text underline position under to determine, so auto puts it where we're used to seeing it, but under puts it underneath all of the descenders. However, mileage may vary on that one in terms of the support. So be aware of that. It's fun to play with, but the support isn't quite there. So now that we have pretty links, let's look at our line length. Because line length, right now in the window I'm showing it at, looks pretty cool, pretty readable. Yeah, not so much anymore. So what we can do for line length is, generally speaking, what is considered really readable is anything between 39 and 54 letters, or 1.5 to 2 times the alphabet. If you were to write out the alphabet, that is about the level of line length that is considered ideal for readability. So we actually have a property we can use to determine that, and it is CH. It's approximative, but CH looks at the letter O, and that value is equal to the width of the letter O. Why they picked O, I have no idea. Other than it's pretty average. It's not super skinny like an I, but it's not super wide like maybe a W. So it's a pretty average letter in a lot of ways. But what it will allow you to do is go ahead and pick a width based on something more or less, scientific, rather than I'm gonna guess at it, right? So how we can implement that is simply by saying, hey, my paragraph tags, I want you to have a max width of 54 CH, or whatever the case might be. So you've got limitless amounts of values you can use, right? Some of them static, some of them relative, but we're going to kind of focus on CH at this particular point in time. We will talk a little bit about EX. EX is that X height. Remember when I was showing you the diagram with kind of the vocabulary and I talked about EX? That one is available. It's based on the X height. It's really cool for doing your padding width, for example, so that you can have, your top and bottom paddings that are relative to your font size inside. That can make for some really pretty, really very finished looking designs. I use it a decent bit for that, and it also means that the amount of space will increase and decrease because it's relative to the font size of the container. Similar to how M's would be. It means that size will increase and decrease based on the font size, so your padding would increase and decrease accordingly, which is super cool. So if we go ahead and remember I said like with half the alphabet, right, 39 to 52 letters is kind of that ideal gap. If we go ahead and do that, this is kind of what it looks like for, and the font I'm using right here is Barlow. So that's kind of where it looks like in terms of the width. So I'm like, okay, if I'm at 39, I have a decent bit of room. I could stick 2 columns. So let's go ahead and stick some columns. Columns are awesome without even using grid or anything. I can just tell it, hey, column width 39 CH, and it'll automatically take my text. And when I run out of, it's going to fill up my page so that I have 2 columns of text without having to make a breakpoint. The downside to that, though, is that you would have to scroll all the way down through the first column, scroll back to the top, and scroll all the way down to the second column. Not ideal on usage. So I'm like, okay, fine. We'll do the sideways scroll, and I'll max out the height. But again, sideways scroll, not ideal either. Where this really shines is if you're dealing with print. Because a lot of times, how often have you been asked for, I need a print view of this, right? And so you can totally do that using a media query, media@print. And that's where you can get this sort of thing because column is aware of where your page stops and starts. So things for ebooks, for print, for just, at print, for those sorts of things, it's really great because it is aware of the page, which means you don't get that whole scroll issue of having to go all the way down the document and back up again, or left to right because of maxing out your height. It will automatically do it correctly. So if you ever need to make a print layout for something or a print-friendly layout for something, columns are really, really nice. Be very careful with CH, however, depending on what browser version you're running. CH sometimes doesn't work for print, and so, but at this point you know your paper width, so you can determine that and the number of columns you need based on that, because unlike web, print is very, very square, and it is not going to suddenly expand or retract on you magically. However fun that would be, it's just not going to. So back to here. The other thing we can do is remember, for some of you, I know they did this in American schools, but we always had to indent the first paragraph, like the first line of the first paragraph for some reason. That was a thing when we were in school for writing essays. That's something we had to do. You can do that in the web. It's called text indent, and it will naturally indent your paragraph if you want it to be. The thing with that is you can actually do each line versus hanging on some browsers, but it's still very experimental. And again, support is mileage will vary wildly. But that would allow you to go ahead and do a hanging, which means it would indent it backwards, or to indent everything. But at that point, just margin it. That works too. More that we can do with our text is obviously we can look at how we do our alignment. By default, things are left justified, at least in our Western world. The thing though is you actually have several options with that. You can center justify, left justify justified, which is basically everything is the same width everywhere, and you can right justify. The thing though is you're gonna have to watch the readability on that. Center is probably the worst because your lines never start and stop anywhere the same place. So for large bodies of text, when you're trying to read, you don't know where to come back to with your eye as you're reading through the lines, which significantly decreases the speed at which your users are going to be able to read. The left justify is obviously the most common and probably one of the best. Left justify has the same problem as center. You don't know where your eye comes back to. That's problematic. The justify is fun and it looks really, really clean, but it does have one little problem with it, and those are called rivers. And so what happens is because you're not going with the natural width of the letters between them, you're adding this artificial space to make the words take up the entire line, you end up with these weird gaps. And what happens with these weird gaps is visually, if you're looking at the text afar and mildly blurred, they'll make these white lines, assuming your background is white. They'll make these white lines all the way down your paper. And you'll end up with some very awkward spacing, especially if you have very little words. So if you look at the lines that I have highlighted, because they're very little words, you get some really weird stuff going on. So making sure that you have a font that deals well with that, or that your line length are appropriate enough to deal with that, is something to look at. You can manually through spans and whatever clean it up. It's a very short text, but that gets obnoxious very, very quickly. So keep that in mind with the rivers. The other thing we can do is play with our kerning. Kerning is also known as letter spacing in CSS, is adjusting the space between the letters. So kerning the first hello has its natural spacing. Each block would have been one of the metal pieces for a printing press. Kerning will allow us to say, yeah, we're actually going to scrunch that a little bit or expand it depending, but it means there's some overlap between it. And so what that allows us to do is make the amount of space between each piece narrower or wider. When we talk about kerning and print design and in graphics design, software like Illustrator, for example, will literally allow us to go and play with each individual letter independently. CSS isn't quite that sophisticated, but it will allow you to adjust the spacing between all of the letters in a particular container. So in a div span, whatever, choose your poison. So we can totally, in this particular case, I totally blew up the spacing, right? we can totally say, hey, I want this to be much wider. Same problem as you're going to have with, changing the spacing between your words, changing the spacing between your letters, because it's a lot less natural, there's a lot more space between them, is going to make it a lot harder for a user to go ahead and read. So those are things to, again, use for emphasis, use for cool factor, and use very, very sparingly, and not for any amount of text, not for general bodies of text. But they're fun to play with. Font variants. Now that we've talked about a spacing a whole bunch, do we have any questions on spacing, by the way? Okay. So font variants. Font variants allow you to play with the actual font itself and do some tweaking and some fine tuning on the font itself. It has a lot of properties. A lot of them you will very rarely see in the wild, but they do exist and they're fairly well supported. The big ones that I'm going to focus on right now are the ones related to ligatures and the ones related to numbers. The other sets, one of them is very specifically related to Asian languages, and so non-Latin letter forms, which I know very little about, so we're not going to talk about that today. But the big two that we see a lot with Latin letters are going to be things related to numbers and ligatures. So let's talk about ligatures first. Ligatures are basically when you take two letters and morph them into one. And they're made for stylistic things and for pretty things. The most common ligatures that exist are between FL, FI, FF. And so they look like the example I have below. This is in railway. Railway has some very pretty ligatures, but they what it allows us, it just gives a little bit more flair to the text and changes it up a little bit. So what you can do with some of these properties is determine, do you want ligatures to happen, yes or no? A lot of the icon libraries, icon fonts will have some setting related to ligature that have nothing to do with this concept, but that is the concept that they're banking on in order for the font variant to work. And oftentimes you might have to turn ligatures off for that particular class in order for font variants to work. So worth knowing as a gotcha. The other part with numbers is there are two types of numbers in terms of their stylistic approach. One is called old style figure and the other one is a modern figure. Old style figures do not necessarily follow the baseline. So if the blue line at the blue lines I have on there are basically your X height and your baseline. Baseline being the bottom one, X height being the top one. In old style figures, a certain number of numbers will bleed over and under. And so for things like anything that is very math heavy, where you're wanting to align those numbers beautifully, those are going to not work very well for you. They're very pretty, but in terms of the readability on something that is very, very computation, very math, like a business report of some kind that has a lot of numbers, probably not a good choice. The modern figures are basically neatly aligned to your baseline and X height. So they're going to be a lot easier to read, a lot easier to align for things that are very, very number heavy. But we can tweak that. So Railway, which is one of the fonts I've used a lot in here, has old style figures. And so does Barlow. And so in this particular case, I can tweak that in order for, and this example shows it very, very lightly. I should have blown it up a little bit more, but what happens is by setting a font variant of lining nums, I can say, hey, I actually want you to, even though by default you're an old style number, I'm going to set you up to be a modern style. And I'm going to, by the CSS will realign them to follow baseline, which is super awesome. The other things that you can do with font variant is small caps, which basically means that it's using all uppercase letters. However, if you're not actually capitalizing, it will make a smaller version of the uppercase letter, which is a lot of fun. So you can see the top version would be the default. The bottom version is the one with the small caps. And the lining nums. These properties, I'm going to switch back to them really, really quickly. There we go. There are a lot of them. Oops, there we go. There are a lot of them. Have fun looking through them. We don't have enough time today to go through all of them. I just wanted to make you guys aware that they do exist. If you go, most of these you can find, I really love the MDN for this sort of information. They have great examples on what to do and how to implement and what they would be used for. So that's our font variants and our text transform. Text transform is a little bit different than font variant. Font variant actually changes the font you're going to do. Text transform actually changes how the font gets used. There's 5 different properties you can use for that: capitalize, uppercase, lowercase, full width, and full size canna. Full width and full size canna are mainly used for non-Latin languages. They have to do with, if you've got non-Latin letters, how wide and how to adjust those. The ones that you often see in the Western world with Latin languages are going to be capitalized, uppercase, and lowercase. They're going to be very much your equivalent to your JavaScript capitalized, uppercase. And actually, JavaScript doesn't have a capitalized, but very much the equivalent of your uppercase and lowercase for JavaScript. Capitalized just goes for the first letter, which would be really cool if JavaScript had, but it doesn't. Doesn't that I know of. So what that's really fun for is things where if you want to make sure that stylistically, say, all of your buttons or all of your titles are always all capitalized, that's a really cool thing that you can do to help you have that consistency and not rely on the data being consistent. However, it is completely ignorant of words such as the and of that you may not want to capitalize in a title. So if you look at the example I have here, the second one is the home under the ground. It says the home, which the first one, yeah, sure, capitalized. Home, sure, capitalized. Under the is kind of here or there, whether it could be capitalized or not. If I do capitalize on it, it'll just go ahead and capitalize every word. So pros and cons on that, but really, really good one for consistency purposes. Or if you work in an environment where your database always sends you back your addresses in all uppercase, which I have I've worked on a project in that case. It's really great to be able to, switch it back to something more human readable, because all uppercase is very much not near as readable as normal standard casing. And it feels like you're getting yelled at all the time. Last but not least, I'm going to go through images, and this is kind of leaning into something a little bit different, but super cool and worth knowing about. Images, the reason float kind of fell out of style when flex and grid and all that fun stuff came about, but float is still really, really, really nice and really important for when you're trying to have like an article or something and you want your image inside your text nicely placed. The other thing we can do with float is actually alter the bounds of that image to go ahead and do something like this and make the float curve to the image. And so the way you do that, and you can do that, I did it with an ellipses, but you can do it with a polygon, you can do it with a circle, you can do it with any sort of shape really. And what you're going to say is on that image, not only is it going to be floated, but you're going to give it the shape outside, which determines what that shape is going to be. And that's where you can use an inset, you can use a circle and whatever polygon of your choice. But the other piece that you need to do is the clip path, which basically hides the piece of the image that is gone. So you can do all sorts of really fun things. If you have I usually start with an SVG, unless I'm doing something as simple as an ellipse or a circle. Like if you have a fancy SVG, you can totally take that SVG and make your text wrap around whatever fancy shape, your logo, whatever the case might be. So you can do some really cool stuff there, but you could do an entire talk on how this stuff works. I just wanted to put it out there on, this is super cool. It's called CSS Shapes. Totally look at it. It's fun. It's right there in the spec and really well supported. It's just, getting those polygons written is kind of tedious. So that is what I have for you guys today. For those who want to see the ridiculous code, last comment before we go down that road. Notice that all of these examples are not in lorem ipsum. There is a very, very good reason for that. And the reason is that when you're typesetting something, when you're trying to figure out how your typography is going to work, the big thing is you want to make sure it's readable, right? The end all be all is, yes, it needs to be pretty, but if the user can't read it and understand it, there's no point. So what you want to do is make sure that text is readable. Laura Ibsen is really close to real words, but it's not like you can sit there and read the text and say, yeah, this is working, or no, this is giving me a headache. There's no way anybody's going to suffer through this. If you're using a real piece of text, you can totally do that with. So what I usually do is hop onto the Gutenberg project, steal the first chapter of whatever book that I, want to read, enjoy reading or whatever, and stick that in there. Because it's neutral enough, it's whatever. So in this particular case, I used a combination of, depending on which examples, of Peter Pan and Beowulf, but you can pick whatever you want and whatever floats your boat. But I would highly recommend using actual text if you don't have whatever the final is supposed to be as your placeholder, rather than lorem ipsum. Lorem ipsum has its place, but not when you're trying to figure out if your text is readable. So that was my last tidbit. So this is where you can find all the fancy schmancy code that I just shown actually implemented, and feel free to play with it. And I will take any questions if you have them.
Can you give us some of your thoughts on variable fonts?
I have not played with them very, very much, simply because there are very few of them out there. So, and I don't know, I don't know how supported they are at the moment. And most of the projects I'm working on, the fonts that for brand guideline reasons that I'm having to use are not variable fonts and are not available as variable fonts. So I've not had a chance to really play with them. I would assume, based on the fact that you're only loading one font and that you're using, math and algorithms to scale them, that they would be more performant. Where I'm a little nostalgic about it is that when you look at some of the, especially some of the older typeface or some of the more elegant typeface, more for example, the italics and the italics, bolds, and regulars are very different from each other, and they have very different characteristics. They're not super obvious to somebody that's not obsessed with typeface and typography, but they're very much there. And I fear that the variable fonts are going to lose that. I'm not sure. I can't say for sure, but I fear that will happen.
I have a question, Martine.
Yes.
How mature is all this stuff in terms of being able to prepare content that is going to be published online and in print? Because there's a lot of the techniques that you've been demonstrating, which was awesome, by the way. I learned so much cool stuff that I didn't know you could do on the web just by watching that talk. But I'm also doing a bunch of work at the moment for stuff which is going to be distributed as printed pages or PDFs, the intention being to print. Are we at a point yet where you can actually create an HTML document, and when you send it to PDF, you get something that's ready to go to print?
As a general rule, yeah, we're pretty well close. A lot of these things will work. Like if, for example, if I were to, like, this is on Google Slides, right, or whatever. So it's not a very good example, but if you take that that project that I have on GitHub and you do a print to PDF, it will stay put, and it will look great. That print, that at print or whatever, that's where you want to play. There's a handful of kind of intricacies with a couple of the variable, some of the variable units kind of decide to be a pain in the butt sometimes. But as 99% of, if your browser supports it, the likelihood of it being able to translate it into the into the PDF form is actually pretty solid. And I would just highly bank on that at print. If you're dealing with email, that is a whole different beast. Email clients are light years behind. You're still having to do things like table layouts and stuff.
Yeah.
So email is a whole different beast. But in terms of printing to PDF, most of this just kind of works.
Cool.
Fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. There was so much cool stuff in there I'd never seen before. So thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Nope. You looks like you've achieved complete enlightenment. Well done. Total understanding.
Thanks to you guys who turned the cameras on, by the way. That was super sweet and super awesome, because having some faces to look at is super awesome. So thank you very much for that.
All right. Nice work. I'm going to jump off. See you on Slack.
See you on Slack. Bye, guys.